My name is Kurt Miner. I'm Senior Curator of History here at the State Museum of Pennsylvania. And I was a project curator for the exhibit behind me. It's called Pennsylvania Turnpike, America's First Superhighway. We opened this exhibit in October of 2015 to mark the 75th anniversary of the opening of the original section of the Pennsylvania Turnpike. When it opened on that date, October 1st, 1940, it was hailed as America's first superhighway and our country's answer to the German Autobahn. What's interesting about the Pennsylvania Turnpike, which when it first opened connected Harrisburg and Pittsburgh through 160 miles of four-lane paved highway, is that it was considered a kind of the eighth wonder of the world. There was nothing else quite like it. What's interesting today, by contrast, is that the Pennsylvania Turnpike is now considered kind of unremarkable, and we thought that was an interesting part of the story. And that's, I think, because the same features which made the Turnpike so unique and so much unlike any other highway when it opened in 1940 were then so widely replicated across the country, so that today we now, when we travel, expect to find 4 lanes of highway whenever we travel any sort of distance. Those design and construction techniques that were pioneered by the Pennsylvania Turnpike over time became embedded in America's interstate highway system. It was unique, and to really appreciate it, you have to understand what highway travel was like before the Pennsylvania Turnpike. The Pennsylvania Turnpike developed the formula that was widely copied across the rest of the country for what was considered a superhighway. Superhighway is a term that has fallen out of disuse, but when it was first introduced in the late 30s, it was intended to describe a kind of dream highway, as they would have called it at that time, that allowed for fast, safe, and efficient travel over long distances. Some of those features included straight paths or straight roadways with very low grade. It was flat through what was otherwise pretty rugged terrain. In case of Pennsylvania, it was the Allegheny Mountains that the Pennsylvania Turnpike traversed. The Pennsylvania Turnpike was the first roadway that engineered around both man-made and natural obstacles to make highway travel fast, safe, and convenient. One of the stories we tell in this exhibit is the remarkable story of the building of the Pennsylvania Turnpike, which began in October of 1938. It took about 23 months to build the original 160-mile section. It has a really interesting backstory that takes us to the 1800s, the late 1800s, when a group of railroad men, William Vanderbilt in particular, decided to build a competitor railroad line to the Pennsylvania Railroad in the southern half of Pennsylvania. He called it the South Penn Railroad. Construction on that began in 1883 and went on for about 2 years. The project was never completed, but what it did was it created a right-of-way, and a series of important tunnels were partially bored in the 1880s that when the Pennsylvania Turnpike was reconceived in the late 1930s, engineers rediscovered and began working with, because it was determined that the best way to lay out the Pennsylvania Turnpike was to find the most direct route. When you consider the most direct route between Harrisburg and Pittsburgh, you unfortunately run across a series of ridges and mountains that make travel rather difficult. Pennsylvania Turnpike followed the lead of the South Penn Railroad, which conceived the idea that the straightest point would involve creating and boring and excavating tunnels. The Pennsylvania Turnpike engineers realized that they could resuscitate about 7 of the 9 tunnels that were at least partially bored by the South Penn Railroad, so that by the opening of the Pennsylvania Turnpike in 1940, there were people who looked at it and began to describe it as a tunnel highway. It was remarkable to have these 7 tunnels that allowed for safe and efficient passage through what had always been the main obstacle to east-west travel in Pennsylvania, which were the Allegheny Mountains. So in addition to rehabilitating and widening and improving the partially bored tunnels from the South Penn Railroad, it was a really kind of an army of workers that went out into the Allegheny Mountains as part of the construction of the Pennsylvania Turnpike. It included a large team of surveyors who were, again, looking to improve the path that South Penn had originally carved out. Also involved, at that point, identifying buildings that were in the right-of-way that had to be removed. We have some examples of that here. They also, once they had improved the right-of-way, they had to then pave the superhighway. They chose Portland cement and concrete, of course, as the materials back then. And it involved great teams going out into the Allegheny Mountains again to pour this, as they called it, a sea of concrete. This is a raised relief map that we created for the exhibit. What you see in yellow is the present path of the Pennsylvania Turnpike. This was the path that was created in 1968 when the Sidling Hill and Rays Hill tunnels were bypassed through a cut that was described as the Sidling Hill bypass. It also shows in orange the original path of the Pennsylvania Turnpike, which went through Sidling Hill first and traveling from east to west, and then Rays Hill. That 13-mile section that was abandoned in 1968 is still known today as the abandoned Turnpike. It's used today by bicyclists who travel that path just to see what the original section of the Turnpike would have looked like, and to travel through that same Sidling Hill tunnel and portal that we have a scale model for. When the Turnpike first opened, there were 10 designated entrances, and Irwin was one of them. And to access the Turnpike, motorists would have driven by one of these toll booths and would have gotten their ticket for entry. We also included, as part of this centerpiece, this tableau, a 1948 Packard, which is sort of typical of the early vehicles that would have been traveling the Turnpike when it first opened in the 1940s and into the 1950s. It's a family vehicle. And what's interesting to think about now is that people came to the Pennsylvania Turnpike for what we consider pleasure driving. It was just a treat to be on what was then described as this dream highway. And we show here in this tableau what the kind of scenery people would have seen as they traveled down the Turnpike and went through the toll booths, stopping at the travel service plazas like where they might have encountered the Howard Johnson's restaurants, which were the chain that had the franchise on the Turnpike. This is really one of my favorite parts of the display, because one of the strongest memories that people have when they talk about the experience of driving along the Pennsylvania Turnpike is stopping at one of the travel plazas for an ice cream cone at Howard Johnson's. In this part of the case, we have a sampling of the kinds of dishware that were used in Howard Johnson's, some of the plates you would have found there, an original menu, and of course on that menu the Howard Johnson's ice cream cones that almost everyone who traveled the Turnpike in the 1940s and 50s and 60s remembered. That's because Howard Johnson's had the exclusive license to operate vending and restaurants along the Pennsylvania Turnpike. They maintained that from 1940 up until the early 1970s. So it's a really strong part of the Pennsylvania Turnpike experience. And it's really how Howard Johnson's really made a name for itself and really launched its national brand of highway restaurants. So this has been a taste, an overview of our Pennsylvania Turnpike exhibit, which I hope you will all take the time to come here to the State Museum to see in person. It's a great story, and it's a story that most people aren't familiar with, but we found it really interesting, because if you think of it this way, the Pennsylvania Turnpike, as America's first superhighway, is 160 miles long, but that 160 miles in time gives birth to an interstate highway system. It doesn't just change the way Pennsylvania's traveled, and it certainly did. It cut travel time between Pittsburgh and Harrisburg by half, but it changed the way Americans traveled, because it really was the seed to a much larger system that has now much a part of American travel as anything else could possibly be. It's really part of our way of life.